to be Pikachu's voice. Taking off, Ash began sprinting through the streets while calling out for his Pokémon, Pikachu. Pikachu, where are you? But each time his calls only resulted in Pikachu crying more and more. Eventually, however, once he rounded a street corner, Ash found Pikachu. Unfortunately, his Pokémon was in an extremely precarious situation. Hereby meaning that the electric type was dangling by his right foot from what Ash thought was a cable that was attached to a large crane extended over the side of a big building. Seeing his first Pokémon in such an extremely dangerous situation, Ash sprinted immediately towards the building that the crane was on top of while yelling up to the endangered Pikachu, "Hang on buddy, I'm coming." Hearing his trainer's voice, Pikachu looked down and saw Ash running towards him. Becoming excited for a rescue, he started calling down to Ash while swinging back and forth on the crane. "Pika Pie! Pika Pikachu Pie! Don't move Pikachu!" Ash shouted. "I'm coming." He then ran up to the door at the front of the building and tried to open it, only to find that it was locked. Banging on the door and cursing, Ash stepped back and began looking around for another way in before finally managing to spot a fire escape on the right side of the building. Running over to it as fast as possible, Ash jumped to reach it but fell short. Stepping back several paces and jumping in place, he took several deep breaths and then ran towards the wall of the building at top speed. As soon as he reached it, Ash didn't slow down and instead jumped up on the wall with one foot, using that leg to catapult himself up into the air even higher than before and then grabbing onto the end of the fire escape with just barely his fingertips. Grunting in effort as he secured a more stable grip, Ash pulled himself up and then climbed the first few rungs with just his hands before finally finding purchase with his feet and then flinging himself the rest of the way up as fast as he could. Once his feet landed on the first platform of the fire escape, Ash took off up the winding steps all the way up the side of the building and managed to reach the top in just a few short minutes of climbing. Stepping out onto the rooftop of the building itself, Ash hurried over to the crane and stopped at the edge of the roof. Looking out at Pikachu, he instructed as calmly as possible, "Hold on Pie." He then looked down at the city far below and gulped. "Just try to remain calm. I'm coming." Stepping onto the crane slowly, Ash took a deep, shuddering breath and held his arms out while gradually beginning to make his way across the open-spaced metal beam of the crane. Seeing Pikachu looking towards him with a desperate and scared expression on his face, Ash smiled and attempted to calm his Pokémon. "Just stay relaxed Pikachu, I'm coming. Don't move as much as you can and I'll be there in a minute." Suddenly, at the same time as he said that, the cable holding Pikachu up started to fray and strain before dropping down several more feet, Pikachu coming to a halting, jerking stop as soon as the cable caught tension again. "Pika." Ash held his hands out and stepped forward quickly while being careful not to step through any of the gaps in the crane. "Hang on Pie, I'm coming." Reaching for one of the Pokeballs on his side, Ash enlarged it and then called out, "Bulbasaur, I need your help." As the grass type emerged from his Pokeball, Ash quickly began issuing commands. "Bulbasaur, I need you to wrap your vines around me and lower me down so I can get to Pikachu. If we don't work fast then." At that exact moment, the cable finally snapped completely and Pikachu started falling rapidly to the ground below. Seeing this and not thinking twice, Ash jumped over the side of the crane and Bulbasaur reacted by immediately sending his vines after his trainer. Falling like a stone while reaching for his crying Pokémon, Ash grabbed onto the cable just as Bulbasaur's vines wrapped around his waist and stopped his descent in a fierce jerking motion. The air leaving his lungs as the vines pressed up into his stomach. Now dangling high in the air while Bulbasaur strained up above to keep him, the cable and Pikachu elevated, Ash grunted and then began pulling the cable up one hand at a time while Pikachu slowly raised back towards him. Once the electric type was within reach, Ash grabbed his Pokémon with one hand and pulled him into his arms while setting to work on quickly freeing Pikachu's leg. "It's okay now Pikachu, I've got you. Just hold on a second then and we can." As though luck was no longer on his side, Ash heard a loud sound of some kind followed by what resembled crunching metal reaching his eardrums. Then, mere seconds later, Ash and Pikachu felt a terrible shaking sensation that was followed by them both unexpectedly falling several more feet. Hearing Bulbasaur yell out in a strained tone from above after they came to yet another stop due to the grass type's vines around Ash's waist, the two of them looked up and saw the crane itself starting to break away from the roof as it slowly but surely began dropping downward. Going wide-eyed, Ash shouted up to the quadruped Pokémon, "Hurry and raise us up, Bulbasaur. Quick!" Shouting out in pure determination, Bulbasaur pulled upwards on his vines as quickly as possible and, digging his feet down while fighting against the unsteady movement of the crane, pushed up as high as he could. The movement whipping Ash and Pikachu all the way back up until the boy could grab onto the edge of the crane with one hand. Hurrying over to Ash quickly, Bulbasaur helped his trainer back up onto the falling crane, and once he was on his feet again, Ash grabbed onto both he and Pikachu and then ran towards the rooftop with all possible haste. Feeling the final few shakes and shudderings of the crane signaling its imminent collapse, Ash put on an extra burst of speed and then jumped for the rooftop just as the crane finally broke fully away from the building and began plummeting towards the ground. Rolling to a stop on the gritty surface of the rooftop as he heard the crane hit the street below with a loud, metal crashing sound, Ash sat up and looked down into his arms at Bulbasaur and Pikachu, the latter of whom he'd managed to free just before the crane collapsed, with a relieved smile on his face. "Thank Arceus. Are you two okay?" he questioned in concern while Pikachu and Bulbasaur both nodded at the same time. Bulba. Hugging Pikachu close while feeling immense relief that his first Pokémon friend was safe, he then looked down at Bulbasaur and rubbed the grass-type's bulb. "Thanks, Bulbasaur, we would have been totally toast without you just now." Standing up after setting Pikachu down while Bulbasaur smiled in acceptance of his trainer's gratitude, Ash walked over to the edge of the roof and looked down at the street where the crane had landed. A large crater was in the pavement marring the surface of the road below, while a car that the crane had landed on now resembled nothing more than a colorful metal pancake that had been crushed almost completely flat. Putting his hands on his hips and whistling at what could have been their fate while joined at his position by Pikachu and Bulbasaur, Ash spoke in barely above a whisper, "Man, that could have been bad." Pikachu didn't say anything, merely nodding instead and patting Bulbasaur's back in a show of relief and thanks as Ash turned to look down at them both with a smile that was meant to be an attempt at humor on his face. "Well, now that our moment of utter terror is over, what say we go and try to find Brock and the others so we can figure out what's going on with this city?" Looking out over the expansive horizon that spanned all of Saffron City, of which looked even bigger than usual from where they were currently standing for some reason since he couldn't see anything in any direction except for more city, Ash scratched his head in confusion. "All I know for a fact is that this stuff is super weird. I mean, there for a second we were in Sabrina's gym and the next, here we are in the city but without anyone around. Strange as hell." Pikachu replied slowly with a nod while also looking over the city alongside Bulbasaur. Turning away from the ledge, Ash pumped his fist and smiled. "Well, let's go find our friends and get some answers. What'd ya say?" Pikachu and Bulbasaur cheered their agreement and then followed Ash as he made his way back to the fire escape. The three of them climbing down off the building in respectable time and heading back into the maze-like city again on the search to find their missing friends. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. When she blinked her eyes open, Giselle was more than a little surprised to find herself staring up at a plain white ceiling instead of being greeted by nothingness as she thought she would be after Sabrina had used her psychic powers on them all. Scrunching her face up slightly, the brunette took in her surroundings and felt as though she was laying in a soft bed upon cotton sheets. Looking to her side and behind her, Giselle's musings were proven true as she saw that she was indeed laying upon a regular-sized four-poster bed. Sitting up, she allowed her eyes to wander around some more and found that she was actually in some type of room. A room that had a small kitchen at the front of it, a door leading to what she saw by the toilet inside of it to be the bathroom near the left side of the bed, and a window situated into the wall across from the tiny kitchenette area. To her eye, the room didn't look very luxurious at all. More like what a person who was trying to get back on their feet after an unfortunate incident or someone living on their own for the first time would choose to live in. Overall though, it was well furnished with a couch near what she guessed was the main door, a coffee table in front of it and a TV placed on a stand near the very back wall. Swinging her legs over the side of the bed and looking down at herself, and being more than happy to find that she was still dressed, the confused, newly teenaged girl walked around the apartment as it appeared to resemble and then made her way to the window that she saw earlier. Looking through it to the outside world beyond, Giselle was further stunned to find herself looking down upon a street with cars parked alongside the curb and a row of buildings across the road on the other side. Looking around through the glass portal as much as she could, all Giselle could see past the buildings on the other side of the road were even more, much larger buildings towering in the distance just beyond. Her mind now reeling with questions as she stepped away from the window, Giselle found herself wondering where an Arceus named Sabrina could have possibly taken them, or just what she did to them in general, and even more than that, she wanted to know where Ash and her friends were. The curiosity and fear concerning that particular question only growing since she saw no sign or trace of them anywhere in the room with her. Making her way over to the main door, Giselle opened it slowly and then poked her head out of the slight crack she made. Looking in every direction first to see if there was any danger before just haphazardly waltzing out into who knows what, Giselle surmised that she was most likely definitely in an apartment building if the rows of doors with numbers beside each one, which were stretching all down the hallway on both ends, was any indication. Stepping out into the hall after being assured there was no danger, Giselle checked the belt that helped to keep her pink skirt up and felt to make sure her 2 Pokeballs were still there before making her way down the hall towards the staircase she saw at the far left end of it. Being that the right-hand side of the hall led to nothing but a wall. Upon reaching her destination, Giselle took the staircase that led down instead of the one that went up and eventually, after passing 3 more levels of apartment rooms, she entered into a small, simple-looking lobby with built-in mailboxes on the left wall near the front desk. Now affirming her suspicion that, indeed, she was in an apartment complex of some kind. Deciding to make her way out onto the street in an attempt to get a little more info on where she was or where her friends were, Giselle exited the building through the double doors at the front of the lobby and found herself standing on a stoop overlooking the same street she saw from the window earlier. Glancing down both sides of the street, Giselle saw nothing but rows upon rows of apartment buildings, but to her even further confusion, not a single soul was in sight anywhere she looked. Finding that fact more just a little odd, Giselle stepped down on the sidewalk and then started walking through the apartment complex portion of what she supposed was the city that she was in. However, after she finally left the residential area behind and entered into what looked like the shopping district about 15 minutes lateral, Giselle still didn't see anybody but her on the streets, and this caused a heavy lump of worry and even panic to settle into her gut. To Giselle, the massive city she found herself now fully within resembled a creepy, very spooky ghost town with the complete and total absence of all life except for her. Not even the usual common types of Pokémon found in cities like Rattata, Pidgey and Spearow could be seen, and that in of itself made the entire situation that much stranger. Cars were parked along curbs, stoplights went through their different signals as per normal, and there was no shortage of curbside shops, restaurants, boutiques and other business that were so commonly found in big cities, but it all seemed to be almost fake. Like it was just a painted canvas being dropped over the real scene beyond for some undisclosed, mysterious reason that no one could quite figure out. For Giselle, whom had been to both Saffron and Celadon City, 2 of the Kanto region's biggest cities, the lack of anyone around was obviously completely out of place, but the seemingly picture-perfect, totally clean appearance of everything she saw, meaning that not even a speck of garbage could be seen anywhere, was even more strange. After all, every city had known garbage issues to some degree, so not seeing the one she was in currently with the same sort of problem just rang in a very off-key manner to her. Checking several of the nearby shops for any sign of life within by looking through the windows and failing each time, Giselle stepped back and put a hand to her head. "Okay Giselle, just calm down girl. I'm sure there's some sort of explanation for this. For all of, whatever this is. You just have to find Ash and the others if they're around here, and then you can find the answers together." Yeah, that sounds like a good plan." Smiling to herself and putting her fist into her palm at the end of her comforting self-conversation, Giselle made her back on the sidewalk on the left side of the road and started following it while putting her hands over her mouth and shouting as loud as she could. "Ash, Pikachu, can you hear me?" She stopped for a few moments to listen and then started again. "Brock, Misty, Soledad, is anybody around at all?" Continuing on her way down the streets of the seemingly never-ending city after taking a few minutes to listen hard for any kind of reply, Giselle just wandered aimlessly from street to street, praying to Arceus the whole time that she would eventually come across at least one of her friends. Just when she went to turn a corner onto another street, however, Giselle was completely unprepared for it when, suddenly, she bumped into someone and the two of them jumped back screaming. Eek! Giselle squealed as she stumbled and nearly fell to the sidewalk while the person she collided with did the same. Fortunately though, when the former Pokémon tech student regained her bearings seconds later, she felt a huge sense of relief wash over her at who she saw standing across from her. Not to mention the other familiar face that was floating next to the individual as well, which only served to add even more to Giselle's happiness. Soledad. Ghastly. She yelled excitedly at the sight of the beautiful red-headed woman standing a few feet away and the comedic, powerful ghost Pokémon beside her that belonged to her boyfriend. Giselle. Both Soledad and Ghastly questioned incredulously at the same time with surprise evident on their faces. Thank Arceus, we've been looking everywhere for you. Soledad said happily as she stepped forward and hugged Giselle. Returning the hug readily since she was glad not to be alone anymore, the younger girl stepped back a few moments later and smiled brightly. I'm so happy to finally see you guys. Where are the others? Soledad and Ghastly shared a look before she shook her head and replied, we have no idea, Giselle. I was hoping that they might be with you. Ghastly and I have been searching all over the city since we woke up, and I was starting to get afraid that we were the only ones here until I just bumped into you. Confusion became palpable on Giselle's face. You woke up together. Where? I woke up in some bed in an apartment building, but I was totally alone. Soledad nodded and gestured to Ghastly. I woke up in the storage room of some deli laying on a bunch of bread, and I found Ghastly locked in the freezer. Good thing too, because the poor guy was almost frozen stiff when I found him. Ghastly shuddered in remembrance of the freezing cold torture he had endured upon waking up. By the time I awoke, my entire form was practically frozen solid, making it all but impossible to focus enough to use any of my powers. He then looked at Soledad and smiled. But this young maiden here saved my life, and for that I will be forever grateful. Soledad smiled in return as Giselle asked curiously, so do either of you have any idea where we are yet? The redhead looked around at the city they were trapped within and then put her hands on her hips while shaking her head slowly. I have a few ideas, but I think that the most possible one is, somehow, we've ended up back in Saffron. Giselle's eyes widened. What? How? Sabrina attacked us with that weird blast of psychic energy. How could we be back in the city after that? Yet again the older girl shook her head and crossed her arms. I can't be sure and I can't give a definite answer, but I believe we are. I've seen a few places while Ghastly and I were searching for you and the others that I've been to before on my way passing through the city. I can't begin to tell you why no one else is around or why everything seems so perfect for lack of a better word, but I do think we're in Saffron. Ghastly made a humming sound while in deep thought before finally speaking a few moments later. I can't be sure, but since I'm part psychic myself, I can usually sense trace amounts of such energy in the air around me when I am near to it. Ghastly then floated up a little higher and gestured at everything around them with his eyes. Right now I am sensing very small amounts of psychic energy all around us in practically everything you see. Again, I can't be sure, but since the gym leader Ash took on is supposedly a very gifted psychic, and I believe it after seeing what she did back in the gym, it could be a possibility that all of this is nothing more than an elaborate illusion. Giselle blinked in shock. See, can someone with psychic powers actually do that? Ghastly looked down at the brunette and grinned. You forget the very real and believable illusions that I myself can create, young Miss Giselle. He then floated back down to them. But to answer your question, most definitely. If the wielder is strong enough, then they could create an illusion so powerful that it could fool a couple of minds all at the same time into seeing whatever the caster wanted them to. Giselle looked worried to the point of getting sick. So how do we find the others if this is all just an illusion then? Soledad stepped forward and placed a comforting hand on Giselle's shoulder while smiling gently. Don't worry, we were all captured by Sabrina and thrown into whatever this is. I'm sure the others are all here as well, we just have to find them. That calls for us to be calm though and not panic, because that won't help anyone. Okay. Giselle took a few deep breaths and then smiled thankfully at Soledad. Yeah, okay, you're right. Thanks, Soledad. The kind young woman merely squeezed Giselle's shoulder lightly in a show of affection and then looked up at Ghastly. Since you can sense the psychic energy in this place, Ghastly, would you mind leading the way and then alerting us if you sense anything dangerous coming towards us? The hybrid Pokémon smiled widely. Delighted Miss Soledad. Turning around, Ghastly poofed into existence, a pioneer's fur hat on his head, and then began making his way down the street in front of them, all while whistling a jaunty tune. Follow me, ladies, I shall help us find our friends and keep us safe in the perilous ventures that lie ahead. Ahahahahaha. Sharing a glance between each other, Soledad and Giselle just rolled their eyes and smiled before following after Ghastly, hoping that every step would bring them one bit closer to finding their missing friends. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX back and relived the last few moments before Sabrina attacked them with her psychic powers. Almost like a scene that was playing on repeat over and over again. Sweating from her brow and breathing heavily, Misty shook her head and cleared the fog from her brain as she let her eyes adjust to her surroundings and the feeling of being awake again. Looking around after she calmed down, Misty felt a feeling of shock and confusion at finding herself sitting down upon soft grass in what looked like a park instead of dead like she thought she had been when Sabrina went insane. A feeling very similar to what Ash and the others had also felt upon awakening, not that she knew any that of course. After taking in her strange new surroundings for a few moments, she suddenly heard someone groan and spun around to see Brock just beginning to stir a short distance away. Shooting up right away, Misty ran over to the older boy with a yell of, "Brock!" as she dropped down next to him. Reaching out, she placed a hand on his shoulder as he slowly sat up with a grunt and rubbed at his head. "Man, what happened? It feels like As soon as Brock got a good look at his immediate surroundings, he paused mid-sentence. Feeling a hand on his shoulder, he turned and saw Misty kneeling next to him. Instant relief flooding his heart at the sight of one of his friends being okay, Brock expelled a heavy sigh and shook his head. "Geez, I was afraid there for a second that I was all by myself." "It's good to see you, Misty." The orange burnt redhead nodded and then looked around. "Yeah, but I think it's just us here, Brock. I don't see any of the others anywhere nearby." The squinty-eyed teen looked around and saw that Misty was right, their friends were indeed missing. "Okay, that's strange. We were all together when Sabrina got us and suddenly it's just us. Something obviously isn't right." He then glanced around at the park they were in some more before standing up. "And this is the last place I expected us to end up before I blacked out. I have no idea what this place is or where we are." Misty stood up as well and looked a little more closely at the forested park around them. Taking in the sight of the freshly mowed grass, cement paths that went all throughout the area in different directions, well-maintained trees, benches and several other things that were synonymous with almost every park, and then even at the slight hill she and Brock were standing on. Feeling a sense of familiarity come over her as she slowly pieced together their surroundings, Misty hesitantly spoke up after a few moments. I think I do know where we are, Brock." The teen turned to her and then gestured at what could clearly be seen as skyscrapers in the background of the park behind the trees on almost every side of them. "Yeah, I think I might be starting to get an idea too, but I have no explanation for how it could be possible. Does yours have anything to do with the buildings I see all around us outside of this park?" Misty nodded and took a few steps forward before looking down at the wide stretch of open grassy field at the bottom of the hill. "This place looks really familiar and I think I know why." She then looked back at Brock. "Do you remember when me and Giselle told that story last night when we were with Soledad about those snobby rich girls we battled?" Getting a nod from him, Misty glanced down at the field again. "This is where we battled them at. I recognize this part of the park really well and I know for a fact that this is it." Giving a simple nod, Brock walked up and looked at the skyscrapers in the near distance. "I think somehow we ended up back in the city after Sabrina attacked us, but that doesn't make any sense to me. She obviously had no intentions of letting us go, so why just release us into the city like this and then even go as far as to separate us from each other?" Misty let her eyes scan over the park some more. "The better question is, why is this place totally deserted? It's the middle of the day, not a cloud's in the sky, and when Giselle and I came here, this whole place was full of people. Now it's completely empty." Brock looked down and made sure he still had all his Pokeballs before facing forward again. "Well, we're not gonna find any answers by standing around here, so let's go see if we can find Ash, Giselle and Soledad. It's the only thing we can do right now anyway. Misty nodded her agreement after making sure she still had her own Pokémon and then began following Brock down the hill, through the grassy lawn and onto one of the walkways. After following the path they were on for some time, it eventually took them into a forested part of the park and just kept taking them deeper and deeper into its woodsy heart. The sun overhead becoming shadowed out by the trees closing in around them. Catching movement out of the corner of her eye, Misty suddenly stopped, spun around and then stared off into the thicket of the brush as she called out, "Brock, wait. I think I saw something." The teen stopped as well and then turned around while looking back at Misty. "What did you see?" She shook her head. "I don't know, I thought I just saw, never mind. Maybe it was just my." At that moment, Brock saw something flash by him and spun around as well until he was facing the brush on his side. "Hey, I just something too, Misty." Before she could reply, the two of them suddenly began seeing multiple sets of glowing red eyes appearing all around them in nearly every direction. Up in the trees, down in the brush and even farther back the way they had just come. What are these things?" Misty stammered as she backed up until she was beside of Brock. Just as he was about to say something, a string of sticky webbing suddenly flew out of the shadows and landed just inches away from his foot. The same thing happened to Misty as well on her side, causing her to jump back as it actually landed where she had just been standing. Suddenly, like something out of a horror flick, the mysterious figures in the forest made themselves known as they stepped out into the open and were revealed to be none other than dozens upon dozens of Ariados and Spinarak. Seeing the horde of bug-type Pokémon quickly surrounding them, Misty lunged back and screamed. "Boogs! Why the hell does it have to be bugs? I hate bugs." Brock backed up as well until he and Misty were back to back and then called over his shoulder while his brow began to sweat from the tense predicament they had suddenly been placed in. "Misty, you're gonna have to forget about being afraid for a second and help me fight them off before we become bug food." Quickly grabbing one of her Pokeballs, Misty nodded frantically while shouting back, "Fine, whatever, I don't care. Let's just do something quick before I have a heart attack, then I won't be a help to anybody." Brock pulled out his own Pokeball and reared it back before throwing it forward and shouting, "Graveler, use Rock Throw and take out as many of these Ariados and Spinarak as you can." As Brock's rock Pokémon appeared from its ball and started forming rocks in its hand, of which it had to do since there were none nearby and they were standing on top of cement instead of normal ground, it threw one after the other at the approaching bug Pokémon with as much power and force as it could muster. All while Misty just held her Pokeball out in front of her a little bit and stammered fearfully, "You use Water Gun." As Misty's own Pokémon appeared in front of her and started using Water Gun to blast away all of the approaching Ariados and Spinarak, Brock shouted out another command. "Use Rock Slide, Graveler, there's too many for one rock at a time." Extending its hands outward, Graveler mirrored the move that was used by Sabrina's Lunatone earlier on in the battle with Ash and caused several rocks to appear which began falling in front of the many fast approaching bug types in an attempt to slow them down. Unfortunately, however, the tactic didn't work and the multi-legged Pokémon just crawled or swung over the rocks like they were not impeded by the makeshift barrier whatsoever. Misty was not having any further luck either because even after she called out for her Staryu to use Rapid Spin and Swift all at once, the combination move barely put a dent in the number of bug Pokémon that was now quickly boxing them in. Feeling desperate as he heard Misty yell for Staryu to use Rapid Fire Swift, Brock called out, "Graveler, use Rock Tomb." Chanting its name, Graveler raised its hands skyward and then clenched them together as it began grunting and straining. Seconds later, a few large boulders appeared out of the air above and then slammed to the ground below, smashing the smaller rocks from before like a hammer to an egg and sending several of the Ariados and Spinarak scurrying to get away. However, one Ariados was unable to get away in time, so just when one of the boulders fell upon it and Brock expected to see the unpleasant sight of blood and guts flying everywhere, his mind was sent for a total loop as instead of getting crushed, it simply vanished into wisps of thin air. Going still for a moment at the unexpected sight he had just witnessed, Brock suddenly came to an immediate revelation as everything started to fall in place and make sense to the smart young Pokémon breeder. Showing him a truth that was both a slight relief and also a great terror all in one. Looking over his shoulder, Brock shouted to Misty, "These things aren't real, Misty, they're just illusions. I think all of this is just an illusion created by Sabrina somehow to fool us." Glancing back just slightly after commanding her Pokémon to use water gun, she yelled in reply, "What are you talking about?" Brock had Graveler use another rock throw attack as he quickly explained the situation. One of the Ariados got crushed by a falling rock, but instead of dying it vanished. These things are just really powerful illusions that can't be killed. Misty looked back at him fully with her eyes wide. Then what do we do if we can't beat them? I don't wanna stick around and see if they can hurt us, but we can't hurt them. Brock pointed at the path ahead of them that was blocked by Ariados and yelled to his Pokémon, "Graveler, use rollout and clear a path through those Ariados." Jumping forward and into the air, Graveler wrapped itself into a ball and then began rolling like a steam engine down the walkway, bowling over and smashing through Ariados like they were nothing but pins. Several of them even vanishing into nothingness as Graveler hit them and proving to Misty that what Brock told her was indeed true. Once they had a clear enough way through, Brock shouted over the snapping pincers of the encroaching bug Pokémon. "Now Misty, run!" Not needing to be told twice, Misty returned Staryu and then followed Brock as he took off running through the path in the Ariados that Graveler had made. Even as they did though, several more of the relentless bug types suddenly appeared out of nowhere, seemingly phasing into existence like they were multiplying and also further proving Brock's theory that they couldn't be killed. It didn't matter however, because Brock and Misty were already sprinting through the forest on the path as fast as they could. Brock actually returning Graveler on the move without stopping while he and Misty ran for all they were worth. The entire horde of Ariados and Spinarak now following behind them like a sea of fast-moving spindly legs, clinging pincers and big rounded bodies. After some time of running, Brock and Misty finally exited the thick part of the park and then hurried their way as fast as they could to the edge of it, their sights on the large sprawling city out in front of them. "If we can get into the city," Brock panted while they ran, "maybe we can lose them." Misty seemed to have put on a burst of speed from seemingly nowhere and was now practically leaving Brock in the dust as she ran frantically with her arms swinging back and forth madly. "I don't care as long as we get away from these boogs." Finally reaching the city, the two teens took off into the maze of streets and numerous roads in an attempt to flee their relentless pursuers. An endeavor which was unfortunately proving to be all but impossible, as no matter where they went, the armada of bug Pokémon followed tirelessly. All they could hope was that they did indeed eventually lose them, or else risk ending up as entrees on the menu for a bunch of ravenous arachnids. XXXXXXXXXXXXXX. I swear this city goes on forever. Ash sighed heavily while he trekked down what seemed like the 100th street he had traversed in the search for his friends. The boy's shoulders drooped and head low with exhaustion clear on his face. An expression shared upon Pikachu's own face, with Bulbasaur having long since been returned. "Pika Pie," the electric type murmured in agreement from his place upon Ash's shoulder. Stopping in the middle of the street, Ash looked around and all but fell to his knees in exasperation. "This is totally hopeless. We've been looking forever, we'll never find them." Pikachu was just about to droop his ears in agreement when suddenly, he caught a scent of something in the air and perked up. "Pika," was all he said as he jumped from Ash's shoulder and then began sniffing around from down on the ground. "What is it, Pikachu?" Ash asked curiously as he knelt down next to his sniffing Pokémon. After several moments, Pikachu stopped and lifted his head up with his ears twitching before taking off down the street with an exclamation of, "Pikachu Pie." "Hey, what are you?" Ash began with his hand outstretched, but knew Pikachu wasn't going to stop, so instead gave chase. They ran for what felt like several blocks. Pikachu turning and going down multiple streets, roads and even alleys until he eventually rounded a corner and was greeted to the sight of a horribly ugly, scary-looking voodoo mask staring back at him. Jumping back on two legs with a scared expression on his face and multiple drops of sweat running down his head, Pikachu cried out, "Pika!" in his surprise and unleashed a jolt of electric energy right at the floating mask, of which hit its mark, and after several long seconds of painful electrocution revealed the mask to be none other than a badly singed and swirly-eyed Ghastly now laying on the ground. Overcoming his shock and piecing together that Ghastly must have known he was coming and hence played a practical joke on him, Pikachu adopted a look of pure fury and was just about to light into the prankster ghost type again when he sensed other people coming. Ears perking up, Pikachu looked ahead just as Giselle and Soledad rounded the corner on the farthest end of the street and stopped when they saw him. "Pikachu, They both called out in unison as they ran up to him, and the electric type gave his own cry of happiness and did the same. Jumping into Soledad's arms, the redhead scratched him behind the ears and was just about to ask where Ash was when they saw the boy in question himself appear from around the corner. As soon as he spotted them, Ash felt an instant sense of relief and ran up to the two girls as they did the same to him. Giselle, Soledad, finally. I've been looking all over for the two of you. Giselle gave him a tight hug and then stepped back after a few seconds. We could say the same for you, Ash. Where were you and Pikachu? He shook his head. It's a long story. I'm guessing since I don't see them, Brock and Misty aren't with you. Soledad walked up to him. No, I'm afraid not, Ash. We were hoping they would be with you if and when we actually did find you. Misty and I found each other shortly after waking up, and then Ghastly helped lead us to you. His eyes widened. Ghastly. Where is he? Is he okay? Before Soledad or Giselle could get Ash to calm down, however, and tell him that Ghastly was right behind him, he turned around himself and saw the ghost type still laying on the ground where Pikachu had fried him at earlier. Ghastly! Ash yelled as he ran up to his Pokémon's side. Unfortunately though, what could have been a tender and touching moment was ruined, of course, by Ghastly's constant fondness for a good joke. Displaying X's over his eyes with a small little tuxedo on his gaseous body and a white flower sticking up out of said funeral attire, the comedic ghost type tried his best to play dead in an attempt to garner a few laughs. Ash, however, knew better than to humor Ghastly's jokes in such a time and simply smirked before turning around and shrugging his shoulders. Oh boy, it looks like Ghastly's finally reached the end of his rope. Whatever shall I do? Grinning to himself, he tapped his side. Good thing I've got Haunter to fall back on. No sooner did those words leave his lips and Ghastly was suddenly at his side, looking invigorated and as mischievous as ever. Who needs a rotten old Haunter when you have the first best thing? I am at your service, 24/7 except on bagel days. Ahahaha. Ash just shook his head in amusement and then turned back to Giselle and Soledad. He was just about to ask them a question when, suddenly, they all heard both a loud scream and a yell and twisted around in the direction in which it came from. What was that? Giselle fretted, clearly on edge. Before anyone could answer her though, and from directly down the street in front of them, the three friends and two Pokémon suddenly saw Misty and Brock appear over a rise in the road. However, instead of feeling joy at seeing them, Ash and the others felt confusion take hold of them when they saw the two former gym leaders running their way with all possible haste. Arms swinging madly in front of them as they sprinted with pure terror on their faces. Stepping back a few paces, Ash held his hands up in front of himself and swallowed thickly. Oh man, something tells me that whatever they're running from isn't good news. Sure enough, as Misty and Brock closed with them and saw their friends, they both began shouting at the same time, "Run! Get out of here! Go!" Even though they heard them, Ash, Giselle and Soledad stayed where they were until they saw the massive horde of angry Ariados and Spinarak chasing after their friends. Seeing this, all of their hair stood up on end and they each screamed, yelled before turning around and running down the opposite street. In seconds, Brock and Misty caught up to them and started following right beside of the rest of their friends while Pikachu rode on Ash's shoulder and Ghastly flew fast from above. What the hell's going on, you two? Ash demanded as he looked back at the now badly sweating Brock and Misty. It's a long story. Misty huffed in reply. Sabrina, illusion, keep running. That was all anyone needed to hear, and indeed, run they did. They ran down long streets, into alleys, side roads and then back onto the main streets again in an attempt to escape their eight-legged pursuers. Unfortunately, when the group rounded one particular street and found themselves blocked off by another horde of bug types directly in front of them, they knew they were trapped. Getting back to back, all five trainers closed in with each other and surveyed the large crowd of illusionary bug Pokémon surrounding them. Guys, we don't have any choice, we have to try and fight back. Ash instructed in a rush. But if we attack them they'll just keep coming back. Misty replied exasperatedly while trying to keep herself as far away from the enclosing bug Pokémon as she could. Yeah, but if we don't try then we're toast either way. Brock yelled his own assessment of the situation. I say we try it, Soledad began as she pulled out a Pokeball. Butterfree, use Gust. As Soledad called out her flying bug type, Ash chose Pikachu and Ghastly, Brock picked Graveler, Misty chose Starmie and Giselle chose her own Graveler. Then, with a unified command of Pikachu and Ghastly, Thunderbolt, Shadow Ball, Starmie Water Pulse, Graveler, Rock Slide, all of their Pokémon unleashed their attacks at the incoming Ariados and Spinarak. When they hit, it was like an explosion of multi-elemental attacks that caused the streets to shake, the wind to pick up and a huge smoke cloud to shoot up into the air and obscure the surrounding area entirely. When it finally dissipated sometime later, Ash and the others were ecstatic to find not a single trace of any of the homicidal bug types anywhere in the street. That was only until, however, they found out just why they had disappeared mere seconds later. Yes, Misty chanted as she threw her arms up into the air. We showed those bugs who the boss was. You don't mess with Misty Waterflower of Cerulean City, no way. Giselle smiled and was about to reply when, out of nowhere, a loud giggling sound filled what felt like the entire city and seemed to come from all directions at once. Each of the 5 young travelers could tell who the giggling belonged to right away, and when they looked up in the sky, their suspicions were confirmed. Sabrina! Ash shouted as he and the others looked up into the formerly clear blue sky where a somewhat hazy image of Sabrina, still with the little girl in her arms, appeared and seemed to dwarf all of them far below in the city. Her eyes were as cold and lifeless as ever while the little girl's partially obscured facial features just seemed to radiate childlike mirth and humor in an almost scary way. Hey, are you all enjoying playing with me? She asked in her high-pitched, echoing voice. Because I know I'm having fun. Ash growled under his breath and stepped forward. Sabrina, I should have known you were behind this. Tell me what's going on now. The little girl giggled again before answering like she was speaking to a child herself. Don't you get it yet? You're in our play world. This entire city you see isn't real, it's all just an illusion we made in order to bring people we want to play with right here so they can't run away. So this isn't real after all. Soledad said quietly to herself while glaring up at the projections of Sabrina and the little girl. That's insane, Misty mouthed in awe and also shocked that everything they saw around them wasn't real. Giselle and Brock seemed too at a loss to say anything presently, but Ghastly did as he turned to Ash, his demeanor actually becoming serious. I haven't had a chance to tell you yet, Ash, but I believe this entire replica of Saffron City you see around you was created by the awesome psychic abilities that Sabrina possesses. I can sense the energy in the air. Ash looked back up at Sabrina and glared. You didn't have any right to bring us here, Sabrina. I won that battle fair and square and you broke our agreement by forcing us to come here. The little girl giggled once more. It doesn't matter, you're going to be our friends forever and that won't ever change. Suddenly, a giant ball appeared in her hands which she held up with a sinister smile on her childish, creepy little face. And now it's time to play a new game. Catch. Then, with no forewarning, she tossed the ball down on the ground which began bouncing several times as it came towards Ash and his friends. Eyes going wide, the 5 of them turned around and took off down the street again with more screams and yells of fright emitting from them as the ball stopped bouncing and instead just began rolling their way like a steamroller about to pave over concrete. With as much speed as they could muster, Ash and the others sprinted down the street they were on, which had somehow become much longer than it was previously, like an eternal straight stretch, while both of their captors watched on from up in the air. One impassive and uncaring while the other cheered and clapped as she giggled madly. Not gaining any ground and realizing this, Brock looked over at Ash and shouted, Ash, I think Sabrina messed with the city and made this whole entire street unending. Giselle panted and gasped as she gave her legs all the energy she had left in her body. That crazy little girl is gonna flatten us. I don't wanna play anymore. Misty all but whined as she ran with her eyes practically closed from the effort she was exerting. Suddenly, Ash heard a loud gasp followed by the sound of someone hitting the ground and looked back to see that Soledad had tripped and fallen to the asphalt. Stopping in his tracks, he yelled, Soledad, and then ran back to the downed redhead and dropped to her side. Are you okay? He asked with concern as he went to help her get up. Shaking her head and feeling a little dazed from the nasty fall, Soledad nodded and got back to her knees. Yeah, Suddenly, they heard the others yell, watch out. And turned around to see that the massive ball was almost upon them and they had no time to get away. Looking back at his friends who were now a good distance away, Ash stayed by Soledad's side and glanced up at the incoming ball of death again before pointing up at it and shouting, "Pikachu, use an enhanced thunderbolt on that ball." Jumping from his shoulder to the ground, Pikachu fired a powerful bolt of electricity at the rolling ball with a cry of, "Chew." As soon as the bolt made contact with the child's toy gone evil, the two opposing forces met head-on and began an immediate struggle for dominance. The ball kept wanting to roll on without stop, but Pikachu's focused lightning-enhanced thunderbolt was providing what could best be described as a shield against it. An unyielding force that refused to fail as Pikachu poured as much power as he could into stopping the ball from crushing them all flat. Seeing how much his Pokémon was struggling, Ash cheered him on as much as he could. "Come on Pikachu, you can do this, don't give up now. Give it everything you have." Pikachu gritted his teeth together as tightly as he could and his whole body began to glow bright yellow as he focused every ounce of strength in his body into the bolt of lightning he was refusing to give up on. Finally though, after several extremely intense moments, the ball gradually lost its speed and slowly, very slowly, came to a stop just 20 yards or so away from Ash and Soledad. Catching Pikachu just as he ended the fierce electric attack and fell back into his arms, Ash cradled his first Pokémon to his chest and breathed heavily while he and Soledad both stared up at the now still ball with undisguised relief on their faces. Brock, Misty and Giselle cheering in the background at the rarely pleasant turn of fate. Looking over at him, Soledad wiped some sweat from her brow and nodded to the boy. "Thank you Ash, you and Pikachu. I owe you my life just now. Rather we can really die in here or not." Ash glanced at the older girl and smiled. "You're welcome. Pikachu was the real hero, but you're still." Just then, they both heard an annoyed whining sound coming from up in the sky. Looking upwards again, Ash and Soledad saw Sabrina and the little girl once more up in the air high above the city. This time though, the younger of the two didn't seem so happy. "That Pikachu is really annoying," she pouted in the same whiny, annoying voice. He interrupted playtime. Gradually however, that creepy smile crossed her lips again. "It doesn't matter though. I know another game we can play." "Oh no," Misty said with dread in her voice. "Not again." Then, before the eyes of all five friends, Sabrina and the little girl's eyes glowed blue. As they did, the ball that was now stopped in front of Soledad and Ash began to glow a similar color before. Slowly, the entire rounded object started to morph and change shape. Ash and his friends watched on with not even a little bit of excitement and far more trepidation as the toy continued to change shape until it eventually took on the form of an item that they all recognized well, a Pokeball. A giant Pokeball. "This," Giselle began with a heavy intake of air, "is gonna be bad. Really, really bad," she finished ominously. To all of their great misfortune, none of them knew just how right Giselle was until the Pokeball itself started to glow again before it suddenly snapped open at the same time as the little girl announced, "I want to give you another playmate." To the ever-widening eyes and complete befuddlement of Ash and everyone else watching, the ball released a bright burst of light from within which quickly began taking shape and form into whatever creature lay within the oversized Pokeball. When the light finally died down moments later however, it revealed something in which stunned all of those present due to the type of Pokémon it was. A selection that made everyone wonder why Sabrina herself of all people would choose such a thing over any other Pokémon she could probably phase into existence within her little, mind world. As the truly gargantuan, completely oversized Pokémon finally took full shape and stood at a height that was now towering above that of every building in the entire Faux Saffron City, it raised its head and called out its name in a much deeper voice that it should normally possess. Rattata. Sure enough, the Pokémon that had caused such a shock amongst the five captives of Sabrina was none other than a giant, illusionary Rattata. Its pure size and stature being enough alone to dwarf everything in the city as its tail swung back and forth and slammed into the windows of the many large skyscrapers, causing glass windows to shatter and fall to the streets below upon impact with the massive tail. "You gotta be kidding me!" Misty screamed in exasperation. "A giant Rattata! What the hell?" Ash and Soledad quickly ran back to their friend's side just as Rattata lowered its gaze onto them and began scraping one paw against the asphalt below its feet. Grabbing Misty's hand, Ash started tugging her backwards when it became clear that the fake Pokémon was about to attack. Less complaining Misty, more running. The group quickly turned and began running down the street once again as the little girl commanded with mirthful glee in her voice, "Go get them, Rattata." Giving a bellow of, "Ratta!" the monolithic mouse-like Pokémon began chasing down Ash and his friends with the pure intent to catch them and then do whatever Sabrina commanded of it after the fact. They could hear the earth-shaking footfalls as Rattata gave chase, they could hear its breathing and what's more, they could hear the ear-splitting sounds it made as the normal-type Pokémon crushed cars underfoot, trampled street lights, demolished stoplights and rocked the surrounding buildings with every swipe of its tail. Turning a corner and heading down another street, Giselle looked behind her and then announced with fear heavy in her voice, "Guys, move faster. It's gaining." Ash looked over at Gastly as he ran. "Can't you use your own psychic powers to get rid of that thing or help us in some way, Gastly?" The ghost Pokémon shook his head while flying beside of his trainer. "Her abilities in that area far outclass my own, Ash. I would not be able to outdo such a powerful illusion on my own. I am only a half-breed, her psychic powers are pure and much more concentrated." Brock huffed a reply in that moment. "Well, if we don't do something soon then I don't wanna know what'll happen if that thing catches us." Soledad suddenly pointed at a nearby alley and shouted, "Follow me." Following the redhead as requested, Ash and his other friends joined Soledad as she left the main street they were on and headed down into the narrow alley between two buildings that she had pointed to. Running through the alley as fast as possible, they eventually exited on the other side of the buildings on the next street over and then backed away slowly while staring up at the two large buildings they had come between, waiting with bated breath to see if they would be followed or not. Unfortunately, Rattata showed that it not only was about to follow them but also that no obstacle in the city was too great for it when, with a great bounding forward leap, the purple-colored Pokémon literally smashed through both buildings and reduced them to thousands of tons of rubble in mere seconds. Landing on the street that Ash and the others were on and skidding to a halt in front of them without breaking a sweat. Feeling as though they were backed into a corner with nowhere to go, Ash looked back at the others who still had all of their Pokémon out from earlier. "We need to take a stand, guys, or else we won't stand a chance. There is no outrunning Sabrina, we've been trying that without success and now it's time to stop and fight." Brock, Misty and Giselle all shared equal looks of contemplation at his words before nodding seconds later with their minds made up and a determined expression of resolve on their faces. An expression of intent that was shared by Soledad as they all lined up together with their Pokémon standing together as well out in front of them. Seeing the change in tactics instead of them continuing to run, the little girl giggled. "You can't beat us but feel free to try. You'll still lose though." Ash gritted his teeth in frustration and glared up at Rattata, "We'll see about that." Gastly used Nightshade. His commands were further followed by Soledad, Giselle, Misty and Brock ordering their own Pokémon to use moves like Silver Wind, Rock Slide and Water Pulse. Attacks which flew up and connected with Rattata but only succeeded in making the oversized illusion angry as it bellowed once more and then began thrashing at its opponents with its large paws and tail. Seeing Rattata go on the offensive, Ash and the others had their Pokémon go into defensive, offensive evasive maneuvering so as to avoid the massive illusion's earth-shaking retaliation attacks and not be such an easy target by being all huddled up together at once. This was a process that went on for quite some time as a matter of fact. The real, much smaller Pokémon running around and occasionally even in between Rattata's legs to avoid its attacks while returning fire with their own every time one would have a clear shot. It eventually became apparent that neither Sabrina or the mysterious little girl was expecting their collective determination or the way in which the 5 young trainers were having their Pokémon work together in near-perfect sync by the way in which annoyance and even frustration became evident on both of their faces. Annoyance that Ash and his friends were lasting so long in their little illusionary world without breaking completely, and frustration that the 5 of them had not yet become willing slaves to whatever sick game they were trying to play. The proof of this great irritation was given voice to by Sabrina as she called out in an angered voice while subsequently showing emotion for the first time ever, "Enough. Rattata, use Flamethrower." Suddenly, the giant Pokémon stopped in its efforts to hit its much smaller targets as its eyes glowed red and its mouth opened wide. A cherry-red glow of burning ember flames being seen as it formed within the Pokémon's maw in preparation for the fiery payload that it was about to unleash. Seeing this, Ash stopped and opened his mouth. "Wah! That's not right. Come on already, play fair." Getting the cue, Brock, Misty, Giselle and Soledad all quickly returned their Pokémon followed by Ash and then started running for their lives just as Rattata spewed forth a hot trail of flames that covered the entire street and raced towards its fleeing quarry with a molten fury that melted everything within its path. Apparently however, Sabrina wasn't playing around anymore with her captives as the road in front of them suddenly sprung up and blocked their way by shooting straight up into the air. Ash and the others tried to run around it but the street on either side of them did the exact same thing until they were soon boxed in completely with nowhere to go. Turning around and staring at the wall of flames as it closed in on them without relent, Ash, whom was holding a still unconscious Pikachu, stared at the incoming blaze that was making his amber orbs glow like cinders in the light of the wild inferno. He and his friends huddled up together and vocalized the terror of their imminent doom, but just before the flames could wash over them and Arceus only knew what to their lives within the illusionary world, Sabrina's face took on a pained grimace up above which was mirrored by the little girl's own in her lap. As soon as this happened and her concentration lapsed, the flames gradually faded and died down just before it could reach them. What was more, Rattata appeared to have completely frozen since its controller and creator was unable to give it any demands. However, before Ash or any of the others could process the unusual but definitely appreciated change of fortune, a blur of movement appeared in front of them. Abnormal movement that was immediately followed by, out of seemingly nowhere, the man that Ash and his friends had met the night they arrived on the cliff overlooking Saffron City suddenly appearing in front of them. Seeing the mysterious bearded man showing up out of what seemed like thin air, Misty pointed and was just about to shout, "Hey, I know why," but was cut off by the man holding a hand out and nodding. "I know, but there's no time to explain. Now grab my hand, join hands together and come with me if you want to live." Sharing a quick glance with his friends who all seemed only too eager to take the stranger's help and escape the living nightmare they were currently trapped in if at all possible, Ash reached out and grabbed his hand with the one not holding Pikachu. Giselle took Ash's arm, Brock grabbed Giselle's left hand, Misty took his right and Soledad reached onto her left while Ghastly floated down onto Ash's head. As soon as the black-haired, cap-headed man felt this, he looked up into the sky at Sabrina and the little girl, whom still appeared to be in some kind of discomfort that was distracting them from what was happening, and held his free hand up in front of him. With a stern command of, "Hold on and don't let go," the man and each of his 5 passengers, 7 counting Pikachu and Ghastly, disappeared in the same blur of movement that he had appeared in. Not a trace of any of them left behind afterwards, like they were never even there in the first place. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX himself sitting on the floor in the middle of the ring of the Saffron City Pokémon Gym. Looking around wildly while his heart beat at what felt like 100 miles an hour, his brow sweated profusely, his head swam and his stomach did backflips in on itself, Ash saw that he was sitting in a circle with his friends and Soledad. All of them back to back while Pikachu rested on his lap and Ghastly lay at his side. Feeling all of them stir at the same time as he, followed by each of them voicing their own shock at what had just transpired once they got a good look at their surroundings, Ash turned around and saw the same man that had apparently saved them standing in front of Misty while facing towards Sabrina. His body now glowing a very familiar bluish color that Ash instantly recognized, which was being mirrored around Sabrina and the little girl's own bodies. Hands out in front of him with his face scrunched up in immense effort and sweat pouring down his face, the man struggled and grunted as he focused intently on the unstable gym leader sitting some ways away in the same throne-like chair that she had been sitting in during she and Ash's match. Seeing Sabrina and the little girl's faces contorted into ones of pain and internal struggle, Ash looked back at the man and stood up as steadily as he could while being mimicked in his movements by his friends and Ghastly, of whom took to the air himself as slowly as possible due to the disorientation he still felt upon reawakening. "What are you doing?" Ash quickly asked of the man as soon as his vision stopped spinning from standing up so fast. "What's wrong with Sabrina and what are we doing back here in the gym? And why are you here?" Giselle also questioned with more than a little caution and hesitant fear to her voice. The man didn't take his eyes off of Sabrina as he replied in a strained tone while his hands shook badly, "No time to explain, just trust me. When I tell you to, all of you run for the exit and don't stop." Seeing no reason not to trust the man after he seemingly freed them from where Sabrina had been keeping them hostage, The five friends shared a quick glance and nodded in unison before Ash responded, knowing they had no other options. Okay, we'll trust you. No sooner did those words leave his mouth than the sweatsuit-wearing man yelled as loudly as possible, "Good, then run right now. Go." Trying and eventually succeeding to get the message to their feet that they needed to run, Ash and the others took off for the exit of the battlefield as fast as their wobbly, exhausted legs could carry them. At the same time, the older man dropped his hands and the blue glow faded from around his body. As soon as this happened, Sabrina and the child on her lap ceased glowing as well, but that didn't last long as their eyes immediately snapped open and a violent blue shroud of energy, even stronger than the man's own, sprung up around them like a cocoon and their eyes blazed a ferocious matching indigo. As if she could sense it was happening before really even seeing it, Sabrina directed her gaze towards the door and a blue glow of energy surrounded it just as Ash and the others reached it. The faint outline of psychic energy keeping said double doors locked tightly and impossible to open no matter how hard Ash and Brock struggled to open it up. Realizing that there was no way they could get out as long as Sabrina was focused on the door, the mysterious man looked back at her and his body began glowing blue again. His eyes doing the same as he held both hands up once more and then sent out a bright pulse of psychic energy at Sabrina. The little girl in Sabrina's lap saw this however and held up her own hands as a blue shield of psychic power sprung up and absorbed the blast of energy from the old man. Now alerted to what almost happened, Sabrina turned her glowing eyes onto the man and her face contorted into one of fury as she flicked her right hand and an even bigger and more powerful wave of bluish energy flew from her hands and sped towards the man. Rooting himself, he held both of his hands up and absorbed Sabrina's burst of psychic energy into his own aura field with much more difficulty than the little girl had earlier. However, he didn't let that stop him and grunted in exertion as he began waving multiple half-moon-shaped discs of psychic energy at Sabrina, which she held her own hand up and dissipated each one with. The black-haired girl countering immediately thereafter by swinging both hands in an arc and sending two large slicing waves of psychic power at the man with obvious intent to kill. As they watched the psychic duel take place before them, Misty shouted with a tone of incredulity to her voice, "He's a psychic too. Really? When are we going to get a break from these insane psychic freaks?" "I don't think he's a threat to us, Misty," Ash answered reassuringly. "If he was with Sabrina or any enemy to us then he wouldn't be fighting against her right now and he definitely wouldn't have helped free us." Soledad nodded. "Ash is right. We were in big trouble back there in wherever Sabrina had been holding us before he showed up. I don't think he is any foe to us." Suddenly, the man fighting against Sabrina was struck with one of her psychic flare bursts and went tumbling across the ground with a pained gasp. Showing that he was not to be underestimated however, the man floated back to his feet and held his hands up to his face right near his eyes as he shouted, "Cover your eyes kids, this is going to be bright." Everyone doing as he instructed without hesitation, the man's psychic aura flared powerfully around him as he faced Sabrina and floated a little higher into the air. Legs spread out slightly and the fingertips of both hands at his eyes with elbows turned out, the man's voice seemed to become amplified as he closed his eyes and yelled, "Psychic flare." As soon as those words left his bearded lips, the man's psychic aura grew and expanded outward as it glowed extremely bright. Then, with a banging sound, an even brighter flash of light illuminated the entire gym like a flare of solar energy itself that caused Sabrina to clamp her hands over her eyes and scream in pain. An action mirrored by the little girl in her lap who also screamed just as loudly and covered her own face with her tiny hands. Lowering himself back down to the ground as his psychic energy faded away from around him, the man looked towards Sabrina for just a moment with what appeared to be an expression of pain and anguish on his face before he turned and ran towards Ash and the others. Reaching them just as Ash and Brock were finally able to push the doors open since Sabrina's influence had been temporarily interrupted, the man gestured them all forward quickly. "Everyone leave the gym now. Run." Not needing to be told twice after everything they had seen, Ash and his friends took off in a sprint out of the room and into the hallway beyond with the man running behind them just as hurriedly. However, before they managed to get any more than 50 feet down the hallway, the man that had refereed Ash and Sabrina's match suddenly appeared in front of them with a much smaller field of psychic aura flaring around him. His eyes were glowing blue but they appeared lifeless and dull as he spoke in a droning variation of his uniquely accented tone while holding up both hands. "You have angered the great Sabrina and now you will pay, you may not leave this place." As he finished speaking, a pulse of psychic energy shot out from his hands and hurtled towards the escaping group of trainers. Fortunately though, the bearded man stepped in front of them and held his own hands out as his eyes glowed and a shield of thick psychic energy sprung up in front of them all and stopped the opposing attack cold. Moving his hands inward in a swift grasping motion, the shield shot forward and hit the med mask-wearing man on both sides, his body going rigid and the glow disappearing from around him as he fell to the ground unconscious yet again. Motioning Ash and the others on, the man fell into step behind them once again as they all dashed through the long hallway of the gym with all haste possible in order to escape the psychic freak show of horror they seemed to be trapped in. Just when they were all within sight of the door that lead outside, the other door to the psychic training room to the right of the hallway was flung open and all of the mask-wearing, whitecoat-garbed trainees came running out and blocked the exit. Their bodies and eyes glowing blue as well with the same expression of lifelessness on their faces as the lead trainee himself had. Stopping in their tracks, Misty cursed and held her hands up in front of her. "Damn it, when are we gonna get a break?" This time however it was Ghastly who flew forward as he narrowed his eyes at the brainwashed trainees and spoke in an abnormally serious tone. "I will handle this." The ghost type's own eyes and body glowing blue, he grunted with fierce effort and then moved his eyes upward. As he did this, a powerful wave of psychic energy appeared around the many trainees blocking the door and then forced them upwards towards the ceiling where they stuck to the smooth surface like spinnerack web to a tree. Nodding to his Pokémon, Ash quickly praised his Pokémon. "Great job Ghastly, come on everyone let's go." The 5 of them plus the man who saved their lives rushed towards the door but just before they could reach it, a massive blue wall of psychic energy sprung up in front of the door and blocked it off from one end to the other. Spinning around, they all saw Sabrina slowly floating their way up the hall with the little girl that was always with her seemingly stuck to her chest by telekinesis. Sabrina's hair was standing up on all ends, her aura was flaring menacingly around her like blue fire and her glowing eyes were set into a furious, enraged glare that was directed straight at them. As she approached, the lights in the gym actually breaking due to the psychic energy now bearing down upon them. The little girl spoke in a voice that was the farthest thing from sweet and childlike as possible. "You will not leave. You will play with us forever even if you don't want to." Just before Sabrina could reach them, the man stepped out in front of them and held his hand out to Ghastly. "Please lend me some of your unique psychic power Ghastly and I can get us out of here." Sharing a quick glance with Ash who quickly nodded his consent, Ghastly flew forward and let the man touch him. As soon as he did, some of Ghastly's psychic energy began feeding itself into the aged man's own and caused his eyes and body to begin glowing brightly once more. "Everyone get ready," he shouted, this time not needing anyone to touch each other. Bracing themselves, they all saw Sabrina lunge and thrust her arms forward, a large pulse of bright blue energy rocketing towards them just as the bearded man's eyes flared once more and they all felt a strong tugging sensation in their gut. As a light field of blue surrounded each of them, Ash and his friends, including Ghastly, vanished in the blink of an eye just as Sabrina's wave of psychic energy washed over where they had been standing mere seconds before. Coming to a stop and her eyes widening slightly at what had just transpired, Sabrina's shock only lasted for a short time before pure fury flashed across her features once more and she screamed aloud towards the ceiling. The little girl mimicking her once again as a bright flash of psychic energy illuminated the entire gym and practically shook under its might. A shriek being heard that echoed throughout the now nighttime landscape of the city which caused several people to startle awake in their beds and sit up in a panic. "Ah! XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX had turned to jelly. Their noses could pick up the faint hint of what resembled spices, and what also might have been incense, amongst the smell of long-cured wood that greeted their nasal passages upon their faces meeting the rather clean floor after the sudden drop of what felt like appearing in thin air. Stirring with a groan, Ash looked up and saw that he and his friends had landed in what appeared to be a well-built, cozy-looking, medium-sized cabin that was sparsely, if at all, decorated throughout. A bed rested in the far back corner, a kitchen table and lone chair were set up to the right side of him, a couch and armchair were located on the other side of the cabin near what looked like a fireplace, and to the front of the log home was the kitchen. A door near the bed led to what was most likely the bathroom. Getting into a sitting position at the same as his friends did the same, Ash looked over near the entry door of the cabin and saw the man that had saved them all from Sabrina, twice, hanging up his hat on a rack near the door before walking over to the fridge beside the sink. "Can I get you kids anything to drink? I imagine you must be parched after everything you've been through," the still unnamed stranger asked as he looked back from the fridge. Sharing a look with Brock, Soledad, Giselle and Misty, whom all looked just as confused as him, he finally glanced back to the man and replied slowly, "We'll just have water I guess." Nodding, the older man withdrew a pitcher of cold water from the fridge and then gathered a few glasses from a finely varnished cabinet above the stove situated on the opposite side of the sink. Pouring water into 6 glasses, he then put them on a tray that he gathered from the same cabinet and walked over to the coffee table that was placed in between the armchair and sofa. Taking a glass for himself, he sat down in the armchair and took a sip before gesturing to the large couch. "Please take a seat. You probably have a lot of questions and I will answer them for you if you take a moment to rest from your very trying ordeal." Ash and his friends shared a glance between them before standing up and walking over to the couch. Grabbing a glass of water each, they all sat down on the furniture with Ghastly resting up near the ceiling on a rafter and Pikachu still fast asleep in Ash's arms. After several moments of silence, Soledad spoke up first with a sip of her drink preceding it. "Thank you for rescuing us the way you did today, sir, twice. You have my gratitude." "And mine," Brock said with a nod in his direction. "Me too," both Misty and Giselle agreed simultaneously while Ash gave a small nod of his own head and smiled at the bearded man. "Yeah, we really do appreciate it, mister. Without you it's hard to say where we would be right now." The man nodded to everyone's words of thanks and then looked directly at Ash as he stated in a very matter-of-fact tone, "While all of your gratitude is accepted, I would like to point out that had you heeded my warning the night we met, none of this would have been necessary or happened at all." Ash looked at the man slightly suspiciously and replied in an offhanded manner, "Yeah, but I suppose if you would have been a little more forthcoming with your warning and told us a little more about Sabrina, then we might have been more inclined to listen to you." The man tipped his head in acceptance of Ash's words. "Be that as it may, and I will accept my own fault for not warning you kids properly where it is due, but that does not change the fact that you all just came very close to becoming permanent slaves of Sabrina for the rest of your lives. I warned you that you couldn't defeat her, and because of your refusal to listen, you nearly lost your minds." Misty spoke up then with a raised hand and a confused expression on her face, "But, sir, Ash didn't lose to Sabrina. He beat her in a fair 3-on-3 standard gym battle." "Yeah, and she practically lost her mind afterwards." Giselle chimed in with her voice raised. "Her and that creepy little girl she keeps with her." The bearded man blinked in surprise several times before turning his head back to face Ash again. "Is what they say true, young man? Did you actually defeat Sabrina in an all-out Pokémon battle?" The young trainer in question nodded and then replied modestly, "Yeah, we did. It was a tough battle to be sure, the toughest me and Pokémon have faced so far, but we managed the win." The man's face showed his shock at the revelation as he sat back in his chair and looked down at his hands. "I never imagined someone would actually be able to go into that gym and defeat Sabrina the way she is now. Incredible." Ash shared a confused expression with his friends and then decided to get to the heart of the conversation and find out what was going on with this mysterious man once and for all. Leaning forward on the couch, Ash looked at the black-haired man and asked seriously, "Sir, you know more about Sabrina than you're letting on, don't you?" Getting the man to look at him with an expression of slight surprise, Ash continued, "We've all been thinking it. I mean, you show up on some random cliff and warn us about Sabrina, then you somehow manage to get into wherever she was holding us prisoner and saved us." Brock interjected at that point. "And we all saw what you did back in the gym, mister. It's plain as day to see that you're a psychic as well." "Something that can't be a coincidence," Soledad spoke up with a curious and questioning look on her face that showed she was no fool. Seeing all of the young people he had gathered in his home staring at him expectantly for the answers he had promised them, the man sighed and nodded slowly, closing his eyes as he faced towards his lap. "Very well. I promised you answers and now I will give them to you." Looking up again, he spoke with a heavy tone to his voice. "The first thing you should know is that my name is actually Gerald, and as for how I know so much about Sabrina, well, that part is both simple and complicated all in one." He then glanced at Ash and his friends. "I am her father. Each of the 5 traveling youths went wide-eyed at the stunning revelation and were at a complete loss for words for several long moments. A silence which was only broken by Misty sometime later. "You're her father." The man in question simply nodded and crossed his arms. "Yes, it's true." He then glanced up at the ceiling with a wistful expression upon his face. Sabrina wasn't always how she was now. When she was a child, that girl you couldn't keep from smiling. She had an incredible zest to learn anything she could, and even from the time she was very young, Sabrina showed intelligence beyond her years. She also had an almost unusual interest in psychic-type Pokémon and would spend hours staring at them on TV and reading about them in books. He smiled slightly and chuckled. At 2 Sabrina could walk and run like a 4-year-old, at 3 she could read and spell, and at 4 she could write. We honestly thought that we had a prodigy on our hands, my wife and I, and fortunately, or unfortunately depending on how you look at it, we found out just how right we were 2 years later. The middle-aged man massaged the bridge of his nose. From the time she was in diapers, Sabrina showed signs of being able to do things that other children could not. If you put her toys down and looked away, they would be mysteriously moved somewhere else when you turned your back. If you placed Sabrina herself in one particular area for a short moment of time, she would somehow end up in a different area, no matter how close or far, mere seconds later. Even when you read to her, Sabrina seemed to know what was coming on the next page before you even turned it. He sighed again. My wife and I didn't think anything of it at first, we merely thought it was all coincidence and turned a blind eye to the strange things that occurred around Sabrina. It wasn't until she was about 6 years old and began showing undeniable signs of her powers that we could no longer deny it. She started bending silverware by simply looking at it, foretelling what commercials would come on TV next, appearing and disappearing in different areas of the house at random, and even levitating small objects whenever she felt like it. Looking down at the coffee table, his voice took on a far-off tone. As you can imagine, we both became very worried for our daughter and had no idea what was happening to her. We studied and looked up all the information we could find on what we thought might be going on until we finally found a specialist of sorts working outside of Fuchsia City who tested Sabrina and ended up revealing to us that she had psychic powers. It doesn't take a genius to surmise that we were beyond surprised and shocked and had no idea how to handle the revelation presented to us. The professional we dealt with, an old woman who also possessed clairvoyant powers, instructed us that the only thing we could do for Sabrina was to support her and try to help her powers grow and develop when and where we could, so that she did not become stunted or stagnant with her abilities, which would only serve to hinder more than help her. My wife and I did this for Sabrina, and even though we didn't understand, we supported her and allowed her to continue playing with her powers and maturing in her abilities. Unfortunately though, she had a difficult time interacting with other children due to how different she was, and because of the unique things she could do, Sabrina was more often than not teased and picked on by kids her own age. Even though she attempted to control her powers on our request, Sabrina still had a hard time doing so and would slip up every now and again until eventually, her powers grew to such a level that other children would become scared of Sabrina and of what she could do and chose to avoid her entirely. No one wanted to be her friend and no one wanted to have anything to do with her. After that, and as she began to age, Sabrina started to grow confused as to why she was gifted with the powers that made her such a pariah, and also resentful to those who shunned her. Choosing instead to seclude herself away in her room and spend all of her time honing her abilities in favor of interacting with any outside influences. Running a hand through his hair, Gerald slowly shook his head again. In a desperate attempt to get her to focus on anything else besides her powers, I decided to try something in an effort to get her interested in the only other thing she cared about besides her abilities. Psychic Pokémon. I had my own photography business and was rather well known for my photographic, artistic eye from here in Kanto all the way to Hoenn, where I occasionally traveled and did work. While away on business in the aforementioned region, I paid a young and talented Pokémon trainer to capture 2 psychic Pokémon for me that I ended up giving to Sabrina as a gift for her 10th birthday. Ash's face dawned in comprehension. Are you talking about? The man nodded and smiled. You must have met them in your battle today. Yes, I gifted Sabrina with a Lunatone and who was at the time a Spoink. In fact, for quite some time, my idea seemed to work and Sabrina shifted all of her attention into caring for and training her 2 new Pokémon. However, to mine and my wife's ire, Sabrina simply transferred her obsession over into something that became much worse and far more damaging to her psyche. Once again a sigh left his lips as Gerald leaned on the armrest of his recliner. Sabrina became steadily infatuated in a very unhealthy way with learning all about psychic Pokémon after I gave her Lunatone and Spoink. For a time I thought it would distract her from her own psychic abilities, but it didn't. Instead, she became more obsessed than ever with mastering her powers so that she could become closer and more at one with her Pokémon. Over time, Sabrina even formulated a goal for herself which if her mother and I would not have been so worried for her, we might have felt glad for. After about a year or so of training with her Pokémon and even catching an Abra for herself, Sabrina decided that she wanted to become the next Saffron City gym leader since she knew it specialized in psychic-type Pokémon and the former leader was close to retiring age. Gerald then looked at Ash and the others again. As I'm sure you kids know by now, all children who decide to become Pokémon trainers all have to get their basic academics out of the way before they reach the appropriate age dictated by whatever region they live in to finally get their first Pokémon. All of them nodded, needing to have done the same thing each of them before they could qualify to get their first Pokémon when they came of age. For Soledad, Misty and Brock it was ordinary primary school, for Giselle it was Pokémon Tech from the time she was little and for Ash, Professor Oak took care of instructing him on his general academics in addition to everything else he taught him in the 5 years they trained together. They all knew the basic rule of the Pokémon League in Kanto and in pretty much every region being that if a child wanted to make a career out of being a trainer of some kind to a Pokémon, they had to at least accomplish basic academics first and foremost, essentially meaning reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, science and biology of both human and Pokémon concern, etc. Then, if things didn't work out and they wanted to try out a different career path or maybe just specialize in something else while still trainers, they could decide to take advanced, specialist courses in whatever they so chose to. Seeing that they did indeed understand, Gerald continued. Sabrina, being as intelligent as she was, completed her basic academics long before she turned 10, so once she decided that she wanted to become a gym leader, all she had to spend her time on was training to make her goal into a reality. When she was 13 and had studied all the course material needed for gym leader candidacy in hardly any time at all, Sabrina went and challenged the current Saffron City gym leader. Her mother and I went to watch in an effort to support her, but she didn't need it. By that point Sabrina had become so close to her Pokémon through her abilities that the man she battled against, who was not a psychic himself, stood no chance against her and was defeated without Sabrina losing even a single Pokémon. After that, he conceded his defeat and upon learning of Sabrina's goal passed the gym down to her so that he could retire. Having the title of gym leader itself through at least inherited rights, the Pokémon League sent an official inspector out to evaluate Sabrina's abilities as a trainer and upon passing all of his tests, she was made an official Pokémon gym leader on the spot. One of the youngest to do so. Soledad raised her hand at that point. How could Sabrina possibly be allowed to run an established, official Pokémon gym at just 13? She couldn't have been old enough for her own insurance. I don't know how she would have been able to pay taxes on it and who would even put someone so young onto any kind of a policy to support her. Instead of Gerald answering, it was Brock who did so instead. Beating Misty out, whom was also going to reply, by just seconds. Well actually Soledad, that's not how Pokémon gyms work. Unless a gym is either opened up and then certified as official through the Pokémon League by an individual or a family, all gyms are owned and maintained by the Pokémon League itself. Holding a hand out, Brock explained in a little more detail. Every region needs at least 8 gyms all throughout for trainers to have an opportunity to win 8 badges so that they can enter the Pokémon League. Usually, the league builds the gym themselves, find what type they want it to specialize in and then holds tryouts for experienced or talented trainers to become the gym leader. Whoever manages to pass the trials doesn't own the gym, they're basically just leasing it out from the Pokémon League throughout their tenure as gym leader. Because of this, the league themselves are the ones who pay on property taxes, maintenance and upkeep around the gym, insurance and also things like water and electric fees, not the gym leaders. In return, they only pay their own utilities and still get a pretty hefty check from the league. Which is what makes it such a good job. Misty took that moment to interject. Yeah, and that's the way most all gyms are run. Being a private owner is way more expensive if you build yourself or decide to buy it from the Pokémon League. If you do that, not only do you have to pay all the costs yourself but you also have to pay direct ownership taxes to the Pokémon League. She gestured at herself. I should know, my family actually owns the Cerulean City Gym. My parents bought it years ago and then once they died, my sisters inherited it and used the money from their life insurance policies to help pay for the costs of the gym. They knew they couldn't rely on just that and being gym leaders to take care of all four of us along with everything else though, and that's why Daisy, Lily and Violet started doing their water shows. Part of the reason I also became certified as a gym leader was because they were always so busy with their shows, they hardly had time to battle. She shrugged. I mean, all in all we've got it a lot easier than some because combined with the check we earn from the Pokémon League for being the gym leaders and also from all the money they make from their shows, we've never been in any position where we've hurt for money. But not all private gym owners are that fortunate, and it's why some gyms look more run down than others. You'll never see a league-owned gym looking anything less than immaculate. Gerald looked towards Soledad. Yes, that is basically the answer to your question, miss, and the same route my daughter decided to take as the gym leader. In fact, my wife and I actually thought for a time that being a gym leader might be good for Sabrina because it seemed to be taking her mind off of how out of place and alone she felt due to her powers. Unfortunately though, all of that changed dramatically when we took a family vacation to Lavender Town. Ash perked up and sat forward a little. What do you mean? Gerald rubbed at his eyes tiredly. In an effort to get away and spend some time together as a family, we all took a trip to Lavender Town about 6 months after Sabrina became the Saffron City gym leader. It was supposed to just be a relaxing getaway for the weekend, but it didn't happen that way. Looking down at the floor, his voice became low and distant. When we were touring the city, Sabrina suddenly became rigid and spaced out as though someone had just turned her mind off. Before we knew what had happened, she simply teleported away from us and left my wife and I to search the entire town for her in an absolute panic. Eventually, after searching for what felt like hours, we entered into an old abandoned portion of the city where a terrible calamity had supposedly taken place years earlier and found her standing like a statue near the boarded up and no longer operational Pokémon Tower. She was just staring up at the tower with a blank expression on her face, and no matter what we said, Sabrina refused to snap out of whatever trance she found herself in. In fact, if I hadn't made the decision to forcibly move Sabrina away from the tower and then run with her as fast as possible, it's hard to say what might have happened. We possibly could have even lost her to whatever unnatural persuasion she had found herself under. I had heard rumors about the tower and that it supposedly boded ill tidings, but after that day, I no longer questioned whether or not it was true. There was just something ominous about that place. He shook his head sadly. After that unnerving event happened, we ended our trip and came straight home. Sabrina didn't speak a word of what happened to her, and to be honest, she didn't really speak a word at all. The daughter we knew changed forever from that day forth, like we didn't even know her. She became much more ruthless and cruel in her gym battles, with word even reaching our ears eventually about how many local trainers were scared to challenge Sabrina because of her merciless and ruthless ways when battling. Her psychic powers and the fact that she used them in battle to become more in sync with her Pokémon didn't make it any easier either. People even came to say she was really a monster in human form. Gerald's knuckles tightened and turned white from the pressure he was exerting upon his pants leg. Then one day, when she was home, we got into a terrible argument. My wife and I tried to talk to Sabrina and tell her how concerned we had grown to become over her, but she barely even showed any sign of emotion or that she cared at all. My wife then made the horrible mistake of telling Sabrina that she thought she needed to give up the gym leader life because it wasn't healthy for her, and that as her parents we had every right to force her to end it. His eyes closed again. That was the worst mistake we ever made. In her rage and fury, Sabrina unleashed her power in a terrible fashion and attempted to destroy the house in her anger. My wife tried to reach Sabrina and stop her, but as soon as she touched her she disappeared. Vanished, without so much as a trace. Ash and the others appeared at a loss for words. She was gone. Just like that? Giselle questioned with a slight tremble to her voice. He nodded gravely. Yes. Before my eyes, Helen just vanished. I myself attempted to stop her, but Sabrina used her abilities to teleport me from the house, and when I tried to run back inside, our entire home just disappeared. In the same way that Helen did. It was like someone had just lifted it up, warped the very fabric of space around it, and then pulled a disappearing act that was far too good to be an illusion. Nothing but the foundation being left behind in its wake afterwards. Standing up, Gerald walked over to the window at the kitchen and gazed outside at the wooded glade his cabin was situated in. There was no trace of Sabrina anywhere, and the police were at a loss as to what happened to my wife in the house. They tried to ask me if I knew anything, but I couldn't tell them it was Sabrina. Even after everything she did, she was still my daughter, and I couldn't turn her in like that. Who would believe me anyway? He leaned against the sink. I instead told them that I was at the gym with my daughter, and when we came home, the house and Helen were gone. Circumstances were too strange, and there was far too much of a lack of evidence for anyone to point a finger at foul play or otherwise, so eventually the investigation was just dropped without another thought. Brushed under the rug like a bad memory, since there was no clear explanation to be had. He looked out the window again. I knew what had happened to Sabrina. I knew that she went back to the gym, and after that day, I never heard another word from her. Even still, I never stopped believing there was hope for my daughter, and because of that, I quit my business and started searching all over for someone that might be able to help me. It took a long time, but I eventually managed to track down the old woman who first told my wife and I of Sabrina's powers, and I asked for her help. For any kind of information. She told me that psychic powers had to be passed down from at least one parent to the child, and when she asked if she could test me,